He hadn't worn a uniform in decades, but his walk still carried the sure-footedness of someone who had marched through combat. Frank Reynolds, 78, a Vietnam veteran, was walking on the porch of his modest home in Stone Creek, Texas, as he did every afternoon. The sky was golden, and the air was still. In the chair next to him, lying amid the worn bones, was Duke, a Labrador retriever with a wispy coat, a serene gaze, and a constant presence. They had been together for 14 years. More than just companions. They saved each other. Every day. Duke lifted his head, sniffed the air, and watched his owner with unusual attention. Frank was holding the teacup in both hands, as if the heat of the liquid could warm something that was already cooling inside. His chest hurt, not for the first time. But this time there was something different. A sharp, suffocating tightness, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his heart from the inside out. He took a deep breath. He took a step. And then, he fell. The impact was sharp against the wood of the porch. The cup shattered, tea spilling out between the cracks in the floor. Duke howled. He ran in circles, barking desperately, trying to make the world understand that his friend was dying. It was the insistent barking that alerted the neighbors. When they arrived, they saw Frank lying there, eyes half open, skin cold, lips purple. But Duke wouldn't let anyone get close. His fragile body trembled, but his courage was that of a soldier on guard. "He won't let us touch him," one of the paramedics said. "This dog is protecting him, like he's a part of him." And it was. It was only when Frank opened his eyes for a brief moment, saw Duke standing there, and muttered something barely audible. "Leave him. Leave him," that the dog obediently backed away. The stretcher carried Frank away, but Duke did not move from the gate. He sat. He waited. And there he stayed until nightfall. Have you ever seen a dog wait for someone who might never come back? Inside the ambulance, Frank's heartbeat fluctuated, and even unconscious, tears streamed down his face. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of leaving Duke alone, because that wasn't a common relationship between man and animal. It was a bond forged in the shadows of war and in the dim light of the early mornings, when Frank woke up sweating, panting, reliving traumas that only Duke knew how to anticipate. When they arrived at the community hospital, the urgency was clear. Frank needed to be admitted immediately. But the first thing he asked, amidst coughing and pain, was, "Where's Duke?" A doctor tried to reassure him. "He's home, sir. We'll take care of that later. Now we need to stabilize his condition." But Frank, even though he was weak, reacted. His hand was shaking, but his voice was firm enough to scare the professionals around him. "If I go in there without him, I won't come out." No one understood. They thought it was attachment, a whim, an old man's stubbornness. But it was much more than that. Meanwhile, at Frank's house, Duke lay motionless. He wouldn't drink water. He wouldn't eat. He lay by the door as if he felt, deep in his chest, that something was wrong. The medical team didn't know how to deal with this refusal. Frank refused food, refused tests, refused even medication. He just kept repeating, in a low, non-negotiable tone, "I won't leave you alone. Not again." Again? What exactly had happened before? What silent pact had united that man and that dog to the point of defying hospital protocols? What no one there knew is that Duke had already saved Frank more times than any doctor ever could. And that Frank was ready to die, but not to leave him. And it is at this moment that something changes. Someone, silently, observes everything. A young nurse, until then just another face in the hallway, listens to every word and relives within herself memories that have been stored since the funeral of her grandfather, also a veteran. But what this nurse will do, no one could predict. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. And perhaps move you more than you can imagine. The room was small, with lifeless white walls, scented with disinfectant, and surrounded by machines that blinked slowly, as if mocking the fragile rhythm of Frank's heart. There were 2 nurses on duty, a resident doctor, and a clipboard with his name scrawled in pen. Reynolds Frank, age 78, critical condition. But none of that data said what really mattered. None of it said anything about Duke. About the real reason that made that man, even on the brink of death, resist like a soldier in a trench. Frank was lying there, hooked up to wires, a catheter in each arm, but his gaze wouldn't budge. And then he repeated, once again, his voice already scratchy from the effort. "If I stay, who will tell him that I didn't really leave?" The room fell silent. The doctor cleared his throat, turned his back, and pretended to read the exams. One of the nurses, visibly uncomfortable, crossed her arms and left. It was easier to face the clinical severity than the emotional abyss hidden in that sentence. They were used to physical pain, but they didn't know what to do with that invisible pain, the pain of someone who had been ripped from their own soul. And there, in that hospital bed, Frank began to waste away. Not because his heart was failing, but because of the weight of absence. He refused food. He did not respond to stimuli. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if counting the seconds. Not of life, but of abandonment. Meanwhile, outside, Duke stood in the doorway. Neighbors had left him food and water. But the lab just sniffed, then returned to the same spot. His gaze fixed on the road. His thin body huddled against the ground. The nights in Stone Creek grew cold, and still he wouldn't move. What kept the dog there wasn't instinct. It was loyalty. A rare kind of loyalty that, if you've ever had one, you know what it means. Frank started to have a fever. He had slight tremors. He had discrete hallucinations in the middle of the night. In one of them, he screamed Duke's name. The doctors tried to adjust his medication. His blood pressure dropped. His lungs weakened. And the technical diagnosis was replaced by an informal statement, exchanged between 2 nurses in low voices in the hallway. "He's giving up." But no one seemed to know what to make of it. There was no protocol for saving someone who was dying, not from illness, but from separation. That's when an unexpected figure approached. The same nurse who had left the room days earlier, after hearing Frank talk about the dog. Her name was Emily Carter. She was young, reserved. One of those people who never seemed to stand out in conversation, but who saw what others didn't. She had been raised by her grandfather, a retired Marine who spoke proudly of his service, but who would cry at night, and it was always the family dog who noticed first. She knew that look, that silence, that silent struggle that no one respected because it left no visible scar. Emily didn't ask for permission. She simply walked into the room, sat down next to Frank's bed, and in a tone that was both firm and tender, said, "Tell me about Duke." Frank blinked. His breathing changed. But something there, for a second, reignited. "He's not just a dog," he began to say, his voice hoarse, and then he spoke. For long minutes he told stories, punctuated by sighs and pauses. How he had met Duke at a shelter in Amarillo. How the dog seemed to choose him, and not the other way around. How on nights when he would wake up drenched in sweat, it would be Duke who would press his nose against his face, as if to say, "I'm here, it's still just a dream." Emily listened to everything in silence, but as she listened, she was already making a plan. That night, she sent messages, called colleagues, reached out to management. She was ignored by many, disbelieved by others. But she didn't stop. Because deep down, she felt there was something sacred about this mission. Not just professional, but moral. And emotional. This wasn't just about Frank. It was about so many stories like his that go unnoticed. So many invisible connections between veterans and their 4-legged companions, forgotten among reports and cold rules. The resistance was great. The arguments against it were obvious. Health risks, safety, precedents. But Emily insisted. She argued. She brought data. She presented solutions. And most importantly, she told the hidden truth behind that case. The part that didn't appear in the tests, but that made all the difference. And little by little, the no's began to turn into maybes. And the maybe gave way to a real possibility. Meanwhile, Frank was getting worse. He no longer spoke. He only whispered disconnected names, confused memories of the war, of his wife, of lost friends. But Duke remained there, at the gate, waiting, as if he knew it was not yet the end. The next morning, when Emily arrived at the hospital, something had changed. One of the directors had called her in for a talk. There was a chance, an exception. An experiment, one that was under her responsibility. But for it to work, they would need to act fast. Now that the wheels were starting to move, there was one last step. Finding Duke, bringing him safely, and setting up a space where he could be reunited with Frank without compromising the hospital environment. Time was short. Frank was on the brink of multiple organ failure, and Emily knew that this was possibly her last chance to turn things around. Her last chance to turn pain into redemption. She grabbed the car keys. He drove to Frank's house, and when he opened the gate, Duke stood up, albeit with difficulty, as if he had already known that something different was about to happen. If you got this far, tell me in the comments. Do you also believe that some bonds are impossible to explain? Because what comes next is proof of that. The night in the hospital seemed longer than any dawn in Vietnam. Frank was breathing hard, his eyes half closed, but his mind was in absolute torment. The IV dripped slowly. The machines beside him kept his body alive, but his soul wandered on an ancient battlefield where pain was invisible and no one came back whole. He relived scenes he had never told anyone. He could smell the humid jungle, taste the blood in his mouth after the explosion, and feel the weight of the letter he had received years later, handwritten by his wife, shortly before cancer overcame her. It all blended together in a thick fog of loss. The nightmares were nothing new, but now they were more vivid. The faces of his fallen comrades. The explosion that separated him from the platoon. The exact moment he cried out for help, and the only answer was silence cut by gunfire. Frank came back from the war alive, but part of him was buried in some hole in the jungle. The rest was slowly taken away by life. His wife, his friends, his youth. Until one day, sitting on a bench on a bridge, ready to end it all, a paw touched his knee. It was Duke. The image came to me like a flash. The young, thin dog, with dirty fur, but his eyes said, "There's still someone here with you." And that was how what Frank called his second life began. An existence where he didn't have to talk, because Duke understood. Where panic attacks were answered by a snout pressed firmly against his chest. Where silence stopped being a punishment, and became a refuge. But there, in that cold bed, surrounded by strangers in white coats, Frank felt like he was betraying it all. That he was abandoning, for the first time, someone who had never abandoned him. The doctors assessed him in silence. His oxygen saturation was slowly dropping. The tests showed progressive worsening, and even so, he resisted full hospitalization. When they tried to sedate him, he fought back. Not with physical strength, he no longer had that, but with a stubbornness that comes from someone who has already lost too much. In another wing of the hospital, Emily adjusted her name tag with sweaty hands. The protocol was approved. The permit had been signed. The side yard, once used for disposal, had been cleaned, covered with synthetic carpeting, and equipped with portable fans and lightweight railings. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough to accommodate Duke, with comfort, dignity, and, above all, respect. On the way to Frank's house, Emily felt the weight of responsibility. The neighborhood was simple, with wide streets and old trees. And there he was, Duke, sitting exactly where he had been left. When he saw the car, he didn't bark. He didn't run. He just watched with watchful eyes, as if he recognized, somehow, that fate was about to change. She approached slowly. She reached out her hand, and it was only when she touched Duke's neck that the animal came closer and rested its head on her leg, almost as if to say, "Come on, take me to him." The dog was carefully placed in the back seat. He no longer had the vigor he once had. His paws trembled with the movement, and he panted slightly. But his eyes! Those eyes never left the window, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Arriving at the hospital with a dog wasn't exactly common. There were dirty looks, whispers, and even a security guard trying to block the entrance. But Emily just showed the document signed by the board and went ahead. In the elevator, Duke stood still, but looked up as if he recognized that kind of light, that kind of sound, and felt that it was close. Meanwhile, Frank remained on the edge of consciousness. His fever fluctuated, and for a moment, his heartbeat began to slow. The doctor on duty called for reinforcements. They administered medication intravenously. They adjusted his oxygen. His condition was unstable. But what no one could understand was why, despite all that, Frank was still holding on. It was only when the door opened that the answers began to emerge. Two nurses wheeled in a converted chair with folded cushions and an old blanket. Sitting there with dignity and teary eyes was Duke. The moment the dog walked through the door, something in the room changed. The monitors stabilized slightly. Frank's breathing, which had been irregular, seemed to catch its breath again. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in days, he smiled. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. Emily approached, placed Duke next to the bed, and the animal, even though weak, stretched out his paw until it touched the old soldier's hand. Frank squeezed with difficulty. You really came," he muttered. It was at that moment that a visitor, unknown, discreet, with a cell phone in her hand, recorded the scene. Frank's wrinkled hand touching Duke's snout. A man between life and death, finding the only reason that still kept him fighting. But the impact of this image was still far from being understood. This reunion was not just a personal relief. It was a symbol, a break in logic, living proof that compassion is more powerful than any statistic, and that sometimes the difference between giving up and continuing is the presence of those who never stopped believing. Tell me in the comments, do you also believe that some bonds cross any boundary? Because what this video generated will still change a lot of things. The next day dawned gray over Stone Creek. Inside the hospital, the clock read 6:27 a.m. when the head nurse entered Frank's room and noticed something was different. He was awake, but unresponsive. His eyes were open, fixed on a random spot on the ceiling, as if he were already somewhere else. It was like seeing someone who had decided to leave inside, even though his body was still fighting for oxygen. On the clinical updates clipboard, the signs were there: drop in blood pressure, apathy, refusal to eat, lack of response to external stimuli. The technical terms tried to disguise what, to those who looked with their hearts, was simple. Frank was giving up. Not on treatment, on life. That last night had been especially hard. Between feverish ravings and unconscious whispers, Frank called out names that no one understood. Lieutenant Harris, Charlie R7, and over, Duke, Duke. Wait for me. He tossed and turned in bed, shaking as if he were in the jungle mud again, mumbling disjointed phrases mixed with pleas for forgiveness. The night nurse said she heard something that stayed with her after work. If he dies thinking I left, then I died first. On the other side of the building, in the basement, Emily was finishing setting up the makeshift space. She hadn't slept. She'd barely eaten. But the determination in her gestures seemed to come from somewhere else. From an old memory, perhaps from when she was still a child, sitting next to her grandfather, listening to stories about his platoon in Okinawa. One of them, according to her grandfather, stayed alive because of a stray dog they adopted and named Smokey. Emily never forgot the name. Or the look on her grandfather's face when he told her. In her mind, it wasn't Frank fighting here. It was everyone who had come before him. Everyone who had come back and been forgotten, ignored, pushed into solitude as the world moved on. And Duke, in that moment, was more than a dog. He was the last link between a war story and the chance for a new narrative. As the first timid rays of sunlight appeared through the window of Frank's room, the hospital director came in, something rare. With a firm face, but a softer voice than usual, she said, "We are authorizing it. The side wing has been released. But the responsibility will be ours." Frank didn't react. He didn't seem to understand. Or maybe he didn't believe it anymore. The team mobilized. Duke was brought in on an adapted chair, with wheels and blankets. Even weak, his tail wagged slightly. His eyes were alert. His ears were erect. He knew he was coming back. He knew his place was there, next to that man he would never abandon, even when everyone else had already done so. As he entered the main corridor, the metallic sound of wheels echoed. Some employees stopped to watch. Others were moved. A younger doctor, upon seeing the scene, commented with tears in her eyes, "That's why I chose this profession." And then it happened. Frank opened his eyes, as if something had pulled him back. The monitors began to stabilize. His pulse became more rhythmic. And when Duke was placed beside his bed, the touch of the dog's nose against his hand was like a secret code activating a tired heart. "You really came back," he muttered. "I knew you would come." Emotion spread like an electric field throughout the floor. Nurses cried quietly. The head doctor asked to temporarily suspend the painkillers, and everyone agreed that, even without scientific support, this was the medicine he needed most. What no one expected was that this simple scene, a veteran's hand holding his dog's paw, would spread around the world in less than 48 hours. A visitor who accompanied her grandmother to the same hospital filmed the whole thing without any intention. She posted it on social media with a short caption, "This reunion saved more than one life." The video went viral. Within hours, war veterans, military family members, animal protection NGOs, and even health professionals began sharing and commenting on it. "This man represents me. This is the war that no one sees. For more Dukes in the world." Donations began to pour in. A local pet store chain offered to support Duke's lifelong care. Doctors in other states reached out to offer remote monitoring for Frank's treatment. The nearest military base sent a letter signed by 8 active duty veterans, all offering to take turns visiting. So, Duke and Frank know they will never be alone again. The hospital management, once skeptical, now saw the transformation before their very eyes. What began as an isolated gesture of compassion turned into a nationwide impact. The side courtyard received a new plaque, Duke Space, where loyalty saves lives. And Frank. Oh, Frank started to recover. Slowly, like someone learning to walk again, but with a sparkle in his eyes that no one had seen in a long time. He learned to smile again, to be thankful, to ask for food. Not for himself, but for Duke. He asked for an old radio. He wanted to listen to jazz. He asked for a clean handkerchief. He wanted to fix his appearance. And for the first time in months, he talked about the future. He had an idea. But before revealing what he was planning, he asked for a moment alone with Emily. He looked into her eyes for a few seconds, then pointed to the window, where Duke was resting in the sun. "The war is not over for me. But now, I know I won't face it alone anymore." Write in the comments. Some bonds don't need words. Because what Frank was about to do would touch even more lives than he ever imagined. The news spread like a discreet spark that, when it touched the right heart, turned into a fire of empathy. For the first time in years, that silent hospital, accustomed to the harsh routine of emergencies, the creaking of medicine carts and hurried visits, stopped. A man was on the verge of death. A dog was waiting. And a nurse, alone, had decided to break the rules for something that most people had already forgotten how to do. Take care of the soul, not just the body. The image of Duke arriving at the hospital in a makeshift chair, made of safety straps and an old blanket, would be comical if it weren't so deeply moving. He didn't wag his tail with youthful enthusiasm. It was a subtle, almost respectful movement, as if he knew that each step there had weight. The walk to the side patio, equipped with hygienic mats, shade and ventilation, was accompanied by suspicious glances. but no sound. Only the rolling of the wheels and the silent rhythm of a reunion about to happen. Meanwhile, in room 214, Frank's heart monitor fluctuated erratically. Doctors adjusted his medication dosage as Emily quietly entered and whispered, "He's here." Frank didn't answer, not right away, but his fingers, which had been motionless until then, twitched slightly. Emily took his hand gently and leaned in. "Frank, you're not alone anymore." And then, as if obeying a silent call, Duke entered. The hallway seemed too long for his tired paws, but he walked with dignity. His front paws were steady, his back paws were shaking, his body was bent, but his soul was whole. As he crossed the threshold into the room, Frank slowly turned his face. When their eyes met, there were no words, only silence broken by their shuddering breaths. Emily knelt down beside the bed. "He came, Frank. He's here." Duke approached, nuzzled the veteran's hand, and with a long sigh, lay down. The room became so quiet that the beeping of the monitor could be heard as a beep of hope. Frank cried, not in pain, nor in despair, but the kind of crying that comes when something that seemed impossible happens, and the soul allows itself to soften. It was at that moment that a visitor, sitting with her mother in the next room, filmed the scene with her cell phone. She had no intention of showing it. She just thought the world needed to see it. The post read, "Loyal love." Until the last second. In the early hours, a few likes, then hundreds. By the next morning, thousands. By noon, veterans from all over the region were commenting, "This man represents me. Duke is one of us. This story gave me back something that the war took away." The video exploded on social media. A local newspaper picked it up. Then a state broadcaster. When a national website picked up the story, the avalanche began. As Frank slept, this time peacefully, a storm of solidarity spread like never before. Former military personnel formed groups to help other veterans with emotional support. Nonprofits offered to cover Duke's care for life. A military foundation offered to pay for Frank's home to be adapted if he were released. Most impressively, an air base in Arizona contacted the hospital to send a symbolic gift. But Frank didn't know anything yet, and he didn't need to. Because in that room, time seemed suspended. Emily sat by his bed every night. They spoke little, sometimes nothing at all. But Duke's presence made everything less cold. It was he who signaled the hours when Frank was stirring in his dreams. It was he who rested with his head on the edge of the bed, like a faithful sentinel. One night, Frank woke up gasping, sweating, his eyes wide as if he had been under fire. Emily ran, but it was Duke who acted. He approached slowly, climbed up carefully, and lay down next to his chest. That was all it took. His breathing calmed down. His heartbeat returned to normal, and the fright turned into a sigh. It was there that a silent decision was born within Emily. This could not be an exception. It had to become a model. There was a hidden truth there, ignored by protocols and budgets. The emotional health of those who carry invisible scars often depends on bonds that the system cannot name. The next day, she wrote a personal report. She sent it to the board. She suggested a pilot project, integrated care between support dogs and veterans in hospital treatment. The document was read, debated, and challenged, but something about it had changed everyone's minds. Meanwhile, Frank was regaining movement. He was eating again. He asked for news. He wanted to know what was happening. Emily showed him the videos, the comments, the messages from children sending drawings, veterans sending handwritten letters, therapy dogs being adopted in Duke's honor. He read everything in silence. Then he simply said, "I didn't expect to leave a legacy, but I think, in some way, we did." Late that afternoon, he asked to see the son. The bed was taken to the courtyard where Duke was staying, and there, amidst the sound of the fans, the footsteps of the nurses, and the smell of earth, Frank smiled like a boy. He looked at Emily and said, "I wanted my wife to see this." He paused. He touched the pocket of his wool coat, the same one he had been wearing since he arrived. He took out a folded, yellowed letter, written in the delicate handwriting of someone who knew he was leaving. She wrote this on the last day, and asked me one thing. If someone ever does for you what you did for me, give it back to the world. Don't keep it to yourself. Emily took a deep breath, speechless. But no one yet knew what Frank was secretly preparing. Because behind this whole story, there was one last decision. One that would leave an even deeper mark on those who followed it all closely. Comment here. It touched me more than I expected. There is something that still needs to be revealed, and it comes straight from the heart. The video lasted less than 30 seconds, but something about it crossed the digital divide as if it carried a special kind of truth. No film production could replicate that image without it looking staged. There was no soundtrack, no quick cuts. Just a pale, paper-thin old man reaching out with his wrinkled hand to touch the nose of a dog that could barely walk. But that nevertheless ran toward its owner, with the strength that only loyalty can bring. Frank's words, whispered through tears, echoed more than any official speech ever given on sacrifice or patriotism. They gave me a reason to fight again. That phrase stuck in the minds of thousands of people. And somehow, it awakened something that many people thought was dormant. The certainty that true care is not technical. It is human. And that there are bonds that no war, disease, or time can erase. Within 48 hours, the hospital management had to assign a dedicated employee to respond to emails and phone calls about the case. A military base in Nevada sent an official letter, signed by every soldier in the air squadron, honoring Frank and Duke. A businessman from Colorado sent a blank check to guarantee lifelong care for both of them. But what touched Emily most was something simple. A letter written by a 7-year-old girl in crooked handwriting, which read, "Duke looks like my grandfather. He doesn't speak, but he understands everything." But few people knew how much Frank was still struggling inside. The image that went around the country showed the reunion, the relief, the emotional miracle. But it didn't show the following nights when he would wake up breathless, the bouts of silent pain, the moments when he seemed to be saying goodbye without saying anything. His heart was tired. Age was taking its toll. And even surrounded by love, there was something about Frank that seemed restless, as if he knew he still had a mission to accomplish. It was a rainy morning, with the yard soaking wet, and Duke curled up asleep beside the bed, that Emily walked into the room and found Frank, his eyes open but unfocused. For a moment, she thought he had left. But then he blinked, slowly, and murmured, "I need to ask you something." She came closer, took his hand, and he, with an effort that seemed to draw energy from very old memories, asked her to dictate a letter. Not to him, not to Duke, but to all the others who were still out there. Those who, like him, were struggling without anyone knowing, alone, forgotten, invisible. Frank began to speak, and Emily wrote, word by word, carefully, with tears in her eyes. The letter was about dignity, about the value of being seen, about the courage that lies in the details. It was about how a gesture, a visit, a touch can save an entire life. And at the end, he asked that the letter be read in public, not on a platform, but in an ordinary place, where ordinary people could understand that what happened there between him and Duke could, and should, happen more often. There are a lot of people alive, but they've already given up inside, he said. If someone reads this and changes their mind, it's worth it. Emily typed the text, printed it, and a few days later, with the support of the management, organized a small ceremony at the hospital itself. No press, no spotlights, just patients, nurses, doctors, and family members. Frank was there, in a made-up chair, with Duke at his side. When the letter was read, there was silence. Then tears. Then hugs between people who had never spoken to each other. It was then that something changed forever in that hospital. Duke's space was officially transformed into the state's first veteran animal emotional support garden. Doctors began including the term therapeutic presence in their reports. And hospital protocol was adjusted. In specific cases, pet care would be considered part of the recovery plan. All of this was a decision made in desperation and backed by courage. But there was more. Frank, with what little strength he had left, began writing notes. Little pieces of paper that Emily found folded beside her bed, with phrases like, "Don't let anyone die inside while they still breathe. Give others what you needed and didn't have. Duke saved my body. Emily saved my hope." These phrases began to circulate around the hospital. Nurses copied them on whiteboards. Visitors took photos. And before he knew it, Frank had created a movement. A kind of quiet transformation that doesn't depend on headlines, but on mindset. And then, one afternoon when the sky seemed bluer than usual, Emily came into her room and found Frank sitting with his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was frailer. His hands were shaking. But there was a sparkle in his eyes that she hadn't seen in weeks. "Are you ready, Frank?" she asked, smiling. He looked at Duke, who was sleeping peacefully in the sun, and then at her. "I am, because now he won't be alone." Emily frowned in confusion, and Frank held out an envelope, sealed, with a single handwritten sentence on the front. "For those who continue this mission." It was the will. And what was inside would change everything. Write in the comments, "This story is not over for me yet," because what Frank planned still held one last truth. The day began slowly in the small, low-slung brick house at the end of Maple Street in Stone Creek. The morning wind blew softly through the white curtains in the living room, while Frank sat motionless in the armchair overlooking the garden. The plaid blanket was draped over his legs, the oxygen still discreetly attached to his nose, and beside him, like a constant shadow, was Duke. His muzzle now more white than brown, but still alert to his every move. The medical team had authorized home support a few weeks ago. The recovery surprised everyone, but the prognosis was still guarded. Frank's heart was working hard. Each step was a battle. Each sleepless night was a new trench. But there was something the doctors couldn't measure in the tests. The drive that comes from feeling that there is still a purpose. And Frank had one. Even in his weakened state, he spent hours reviewing documents with the help of Emily, who now visited him regularly, not as a nurse, but as someone who had become family. He dictated letters, coordinated calls with lawyers and volunteers, and kept a small, battered leather folder nearby. Inside were sketches, clippings, and notes. But the most striking thing was a folded sheet of paper with the title written in shaky handwriting. Loyal Companion Foundation, because no one should go it alone. Frank didn't want his story to end as just a touching anecdote. He wanted continuity, real impact, a legacy. And that included something he hadn't yet told anyone. The full contents of the envelope he'd given Emily weeks ago. But that morning, something was different. Duke didn't get up at the sound of the radio. He didn't wag his tail at the smell of the weak coffee Emily made every morning. He just lay there, his eyes open but distant. Frank noticed. His chest tightened, not from illness, but from a fear he knew well, the fear of saying goodbye. "He's tired," Emily said softly. "But he's here. He's still here, Frank." Frank nodded, but his silence spoke volumes. He knew their time was measured in gestures, not hours. And that perhaps Duke was waiting for something before he left. Something that hadn't happened yet. It was then that Frank asked to leave the house. He wanted to go to the hospital. The decision was met with resistance. The doctor was reluctant. Emily hesitated, but he insisted. He said he needed to see for himself what he had left behind. That he needed to end the cycle, not with applause, but with presence. With the support of a private ambulance, the journey was made in silence. Duke followed along, lying on a blanket on the bench next to him. And when they arrived, the two were taken to the courtyard that now bore the official name of Garden of the Loyal Companion. Frank looked around. He saw other beds, other dogs, other stories starting there. And for the first time in a long time, he cried without fear of appearing weak. Because there, among the concrete and the newly planted trees, was the truth he had waited his whole life to see happen, that his pain had served a purpose, that his silent struggle was now protecting others in silence. It was at that moment that Emily opened the envelope in front of everyone. Inside was the official document creating the Loyal Companion Foundation, registered in the name of Frank Reynolds, but with a detail that no one knew. The true president of the organization, legally recognized, was Duke. The will made it clear. Frank's lifelong wealth, his military pension, donations, even his home, would now go to fund shelters for veterans and senior rescue dogs. Not as a charity, but as a mission. Not as a shelter, but as a temporary, emotional, and symbolic home. And in the last line, written by hand, just one sentence: "Give them what the world has never given me until now: time, presence, and a reason to continue." Everyone's eyes welled up. The hospital administrator, who had previously questioned Duke's continued presence, now held a bouquet of flowers next to a new sign: "Reynolds' Room, so no one faces pain alone." It was then that Frank, visibly exhausted, touched Emily's shoulder and said in a low voice, "Now, yes. I can rest. He'll be fine." If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story spoke to you too. Maybe it was Duke's gaze, Frank's silent courage, or that rare kind of bond that doesn't need words, but transforms everything around it. And if this touched your heart in any way, leave an "I would walk with them" in the comments, just so I know you stayed until the end, with me and with them. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel. Here, each story carries truth, emotion, and purpose. And if this video gave you something valuable, it's because you're part of this journey too. Leave your like, not out of obligation, but as someone who recognizes a gesture that is worth remembering. And if you want to continue in this same atmosphere, there is a video here that complements this journey. Click and follow me, because there are more people out there with stories that deserve to be told.